All right, let's get right into it. When you think of George Washington, what comes to mind? Probably a general on a horse, or the first president, right? But what if I told you his single most powerful act wasn't winning a war or leading a country, but choosing to walk away from it all? This is the story of a leader whose greatest strength wasn't about gaining power, but about giving it up. And this quote, it says everything. When King George III, the man Washington had just defeated, heard that the American general plans to simply resign his command, this was his reaction. And you can see why. For a king, for anyone in that era, the idea of a victorious general voluntarily giving up that much power was, well, it was completely unheard of. It just didn't happen. But Washington's incredible restraint wasn't something he was born with. Not at all. It was actually forged in the fire of his early career through some pretty brutal and humiliating failures. I mean, his start as a military commander was a complete disaster. In 1754, when he was just 22, his actions at a place called Jumonville Glen basically helped kick off a world war. A few weeks later, he had to surrender his entire force at Fort Necessity. And the next year, he was part of the catastrophic Braddock expedition. It was a real trial by fire, and believe me, he was getting burned. Oh, and it gets even worse. When he surrendered at Fort Necessity, Washington couldn't read French, so he ended up signing a document that said he had assassinated a French commander. Think about that. This wasn't just a loss on the battlefield. It was a huge diplomatic humiliation that haunted him for years. So what comes out of all these messes? Well, a few crucial things. He learned to deeply distrust professional standing armies, and instead gained a massive respect for the citizen soldiers he'd one day lead. And get this, while he was losing battles, his reputation for sheer bravery just exploded. During one fight, he had 2 horses shot out from under him and took 4 bullet holes through his coat, yet he was the one who rallied the survivors. He was learning how to lead, even when he was losing. Okay, so let's jump forward to the Revolutionary War. This is where we see all those hard-learned lessons really pay off. Washington's entire strategy wasn't about winning glorious battles. Nope, his plan could be boiled down to one simple idea. Just survive. He knew he didn't have to crush the British army, he just had to keep his own army from being crushed. And just look at the odds he was up against. On one side, you have the British Army, the world's foremost military superpower. Disciplined, well-equipped, the whole deal. And on his side, a ragtag bunch of poorly organized soldiers, constantly short on food and supplies, with morale that was always on the verge of collapsing. It was an absolutely impossible situation. And nowhere was that more obvious than during the infamous winter at Valley Forge. This wasn't a battle. It was a struggle for existence. A fight against the cold, against starvation, against disease, and just total despair. This was, without a doubt, the lowest point of the entire war. Let this number sink in for a second. Over 2,000 soldiers died that winter, and not in battle. They died from disease, from starvation, from freezing to death. The American Revolution was literally dying in the snow. And all through this, Washington is writing these frantic letters to Congress, practically begging for supplies for his men who were barefoot in the snow. You can almost feel the desperation in his words as he's trying to hold his army and the entire cause together with nothing but sheer willpower. So after all those years of struggle, they finally win. Victory is secured. But Washington's greatest moment, the single most important thing he did, happened after all the fighting was over. So it's March 1783. The war is won, but the army officers haven't been paid, and they are furious with the new government. So a secret plot starts to bubble up, a plan to march on Congress and take power by force, a military coup. The brand new American Republic was about to be strangled in its cradle. Washington finds out about the plot and walks right into a secret meeting of his officers. He gives this moving speech appealing to their honor. And then he pulls a letter out of his pocket, fumbles for his glasses, and says, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." And that simple human moment just shattered the tension. Many of the officers openly wept. The coup fell apart right there, and in that moment, the bedrock principle of civilian control over the military was cemented forever. Now, to really get why what he did next was so incredible, you have to know about this guy from ancient Rome named Cincinnatus. He was this legendary figure, a farmer, who was given absolute dictatorial power to save the Republic. And after he won, he did the unthinkable. He gave all the power back and quietly returned to his farm. He was a myth, a bedtime story for Roman children about the ideal leader. But George Washington made the myth real. On this day, at the absolute peak of his power, with a loyal army ready to make him king, he walked into Congress and officially resigned his commission. He handed it all back. He voluntarily gave up all of his authority and simply went home. He became the American Cincinnatus. Of course, as we know, that wasn't the end of the story. He was called back to serve again, this time as the first president. And that same incredible restraint he showed as a general would go on to define the American presidency itself. So he is unanimously elected, which is just amazing, and he is so aware of the weight of the moment. He knew he wasn't just doing a job, he was literally creating it. He said himself that every single thing he did would set a precedent. The pressure must have been unbelievable. He was basically inventing the presidency on the fly. And the precedents he set were just monumental. He created the very first cabinet. He'd proved the federal government was for real by putting down the Whiskey Rebellion. He masterfully kept the fragile new country out of Europe's endless wars. And then, and this is the big one, after 2 terms, he did it again. He walked away from power, establishing the 2-term tradition that would last for more than 150 years. His farewell address really served as his final lesson to the country. It's this powerful warning against the dangers of intense political division and getting tangled up in foreign conflicts. Honestly, reading it today, it feels less like a historical document and more like a prophecy. It was his last plea for moderation. But we absolutely cannot tell this story without facing a deep, painful contradiction. The man who risked everything for liberty, who so carefully restrained his own power, built all of it on the foundation of human slavery.
And you have to hold both of these truths at the same time. He was the champion of liberty who led the fight against a king, and he was also a man who personally owned hundreds of people. He was the leader who gave up power twice, but he also signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law and used his presidential power to hunt down those who had escaped from his own plantation. It is the fundamental, uncomfortable paradox of his life and his legacy.
And his final act on this was, like the rest of his life, deeply complex. In his will, he did something none of the other slave-owning founding fathers did. He ordered that the slaves he personally owned be freed after his wife's death. It was a huge step, for sure, but it was also a step he only took after he was gone. It really highlights just how complicated his views on the matter were. Which brings us all the way back to the beginning. Washington's story is this incredible reminder that sometimes the true measure of a leader isn't what they do with power, but how and when they decide to let it go. And in our world today, it forces us to ask a really important question. What is the role of restraint in leadership now?